American Politics Today by Bianco and Canon. Chapter 3, Part 1. Federalism. States are the federal government. Who's got the power? While the White House clings to the past, automakers and American families embrace cleaner cars. The evidence is irrefutable. Today's clean car standards are achievable, science-based, and a boon for hardworking American families and public health. It's time to remove your blinders, President Trump, and acknowledge that the only person standing in the way of progress is you. You have no basis and no authority to pull this waiver, and we're ready to fight for a future that you seem unable to comprehend. We'll see you in court if you stand in our way. Xavier Becerra, California Attorney General. We embrace federalism and the role of the states, but the federalism does not mean that one state can dictate standards for the nation. Andrew Wheeler, Administration of the Environmental Protection Agency. Since passage of the Clean Air Act of 1970, the state of California has required auto manufacturers to meet higher fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks sold in the state than are required by federal law. This policy is one way that the state met the Clean Air Act's mandates to reduce auto pollution. More recently, California had agreed with auto manufacturers to increase fuel economy standards and tighten emissions limits as a way of fighting climate change. Because California is such a large market, auto companies often implement the changes needed to satisfy California's requirements to all cars they produce, meaning that California's policy influenced the design of cars sold throughout America. In September 2019, however, the Trump administration revoked California's authority to set its own fuel economy and pollution standards. President Trump argued that revocation would reduce car prices and increase safety, as the quote from California's Attorney General shows. California's response was to fight the administration's move in federal court, a case that is likely to be dropped given the Biden presidency. This conflict over fuel economy standards reflects a fundamental feature of America's government, federalism. In areas such as education, law enforcement, and environmental policy, the federal government has only limited power to affect policy at the state and local level. Because of federalism, your experiences with government, including the services you receive, the laws you are supposed to obey, and the regulations that constrain your actions, differ depending on where you live. As we discussed in Chapter 2, one of the reasons we have a federal system is the desire to limit the power of the national government. Federalism also enables state and local governments to take account of citizens' demands or local conditions. Information that might not be available to decision makers in Washington. By giving power to state and local governments, federalism can increase citizen satisfaction and government efficiency. However, as the fight over emissions standards suggest, federalism is more than a way to increase responsiveness and efficiency. In many policy areas, federalism sets up conflicts between different levels of government over who gets to make policy choices. In the case of fuel economy standards, while California's policies are designed in part to address local pollution issues, it is also true that a substantial majority of California's citizens would like the federal government to do more to fight climate change. Because auto companies often implement California standards throughout their production line, the state can also impose these standards on people elsewhere, whether they are like it or not, a concept with which EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler strongly disagrees. The conflict triggered by fuel economy standards is a great example of the tensions created by a federal system. Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 election means that the conflict is moot, but the potential for disagreement between federal and state government remains. When local and federal officials agree about fuel economy and global warming, who wins? What are the responsibilities of states, and what is the domain of the national government? What happens when levels of government disagree? How have the answers to these questions changed over the course of American history? How does federalism work today? What is federalism and why does it matter? Federalism is a form of government that divides sovereign powers across at least two political units. Dividing sovereign power means that each unit of government in the United States, national, state, and local governments, has some degree of authority and autonomy. As discussed in Chapter 2, this division of power across levels of government is central to the system of separated powers in the United States. Dividing power across levels of government seems simple, but as we will see later in this chapter, the political battles over how that power is divided have been intense. One important note on terminology: while the national government in Washington, D.C. is referred to as the federal government, it is only one part of the federal system that combines national, state, and local governments. In practical terms, federalism is about the intergovernmental relations. How do different levels of government interact, and how is power divided? But even that may seem a little abstract. Why does federalism matter? On a broad range of issues, the level of government that dictates policy can make a real difference, simply because preferences vary across these levels. Sometimes these disagreements reflect different beliefs about what citizens want from government, but more commonly, conflicts result from differences of opinion about what government should be doing. In the case of fuel economy standards, for example, the national government, represented by President Trump, and the Environmental Protection Agency wants to roll back many current environmental regulations, believing that they provide little benefit and cost too much, while some state and local politicians, as well as their supporters, hold similar feelings. Others, such as California's Attorney General and many of his constituents, disagree. The divergence between the policies desired by politicians at different levels of government means that decisions about federalism, which level of government does what, affect how environmental laws are ultimately interpreted and enforced. See what do the facts say feature. The fact that many policies are administered by multiple levels of government provides multiple access points for citizens and groups who want to influence the details of these policies. Finally, conflicts over federalism create a key role for the federal courts, as their power to interpret the Constitution makes them the ultimate arbiter and of conflicts between federal and state governments. As we will see at various points in American history, including recent years, changes in the composition of the Supreme Court have had important consequences for the balance of power between different levels of government. Levels of government and their degrees of autonomy. A distinguishing feature of federalism is that each level of government has some degree of autonomy from the other levels. That is, each level can carry out some policies without interference from the others. In the United States, this means that the national and state governments have distinct powers and responsibilities. See Nuts and Bolts 3.1. The national government, for example, has exclusive powers for national defense and foreign policy. State and local governments have primary responsibility for conducting elections and promoting public safety, or police powers. In other areas such as transportation, the different area levels of government have concurrent powers. They share responsibilities. The national government has also added additional responsibilities through implied powers that are inferred from the powers explicitly granted in the Constitution. See the later discussion in this chapter. Local governments, cities, towns, school districts, and counties are not autonomous units of government. State governments create them and control the types of activities they can engage in by specifying in the state charter what local governments can do and cannot do. Feel free to pause this so that you may read this. A comparative perspective. It is useful to compare U.S. federalism with forms of government in other countries. In some countries, power is centralized within the national government. This system is known as a unitary government. Unitary governments are the most common in the modern world, about 80%. Examples include the United Kingdom, Israel, Italy, France, Japan, and Sweden. In these countries, the states or subunit governments are not autonomous. They cannot carry out policies if the national government opposes them. At the opposite end of the spectrum is a confederal government in which the states have the most of the power. This was the first type of government in the United States under the Articles of Confederation, but there are very few modern examples. One was the Commonwealth of the independent states, which formed from former Soviet republics after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, but exists today only as a forum for discussion and coordination between Russia, Belarus, and few Central Asian republics. Balancing national and state power in the Constitution. Although the founders wanted a national government that was stronger than it had been under the Articles of Confederation, they also wanted to preserve the states' autonomy. These goals are reflected in different parts of the Constitution, which provides ample support for advocates of both strong state governments and a strong preamble which begins, "We the people of the United States." The Articles of Confederation, by contrast, began, "We the undersigned delegates of the states." The Constitution's phrasing emphasizes the nation as a whole over the separate states, although, as we will see, it also allocates significant powers to the states. A strong national government. Many features of the Constitution reflect the founders' desire for a strong national government. In terms of national security, Congress was granted the power to raise and support armies, declare war, and suppress insurrections and repel invasion. While the president, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, would oversee the conduct of war, Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce promoted economy, efficiency, and centralized an important economic power at the national level. The Constitution outlines restrictions on state power that contribute to the centralization of national, military, and economic power. States were prohibited from entering into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, or keeping troops or ships of war during peacetime. They also could not coin money or impose duties on imports or exports. See Article 1, Section 10. The Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, was another broad grant of power to the national government. It gave the Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Similarly, the National Supremacy Clause, Article 6, says that the Constitution and all laws and treaties that are made under the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land, and that the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. This is perhaps the clearest statement of the nation-centered focus of the Constitution. If any state law or state constitution conflicts with national law or the Constitution, the national perspective wins. Thus, in the case of same-sex marriages, once the Supreme Court ruled that all laws prohibiting same-sex marriage were unconstitutional, elected officials at all levels knew that if they enacted new prohibitions, the laws would be immediately invalidated by the courts. State powers and limits on national power. Despite the founders' nation-centered bias, many parts of the Constitution also address state powers and set limits on national powers. Article 2 gives the states the power to choose electors for the Electoral College, and Article 5 grants the states a central role in the process of amending the Constitution. 3/4 of the states must ratify any constitutional amendment through either conventions or the state legislators, as specified by Congress. By the states can also bypass Congress in proposing amendments if 2/3 of the states call for a convention. This route to amending the Constitution has never been used. Article 1 of the Constitution enumerates many powers for Congress, but the list of the state powers is much shorter. One could interpret that, this as more evidence for the nation-centered perspective. But at the time of the founding, the expectations that most power would be exercised at the state level. Therefore, the federal powers that were exceptions to this rule had to be clearly specified, while state governments received authority over all other matters. The 10th Amendment supports this view, saying, "The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Clauses that favor both perspectives. Article 4 of the Constitution includes provisions that favor both the state-centered and the nation-centered perspectives. For example, its full faith and credit clause specifies that states must represent one another's laws, granting citizens the full faith and credit of their home state's laws if they go to another state. At the same time, though, the Article's Privileges and Immunities Clause says that the citizens of each state are entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in other states, which means that states must treat visitors from other states the same as their own residents. There are many examples of the full faith and credit clause and privileges and immunities clause at work today. If you have a Michigan driver's license and are traveling to Texas, you do not need to stop at every state line to get a new license. Each state will honor your Michigan license. Similarly, a legal marriage in one state, even a same-sex marriage, must be honored by another state. But not all state licenses are subject to full faith and credit. If you have an open or concealed carry gun permit in one state, that does not automatically give you the right to carry a firearm in another state. Similarly, states do not have to permit non-residents to vote in state elections, and public colleges and universities may charge out-of-state residents higher tuition than in-state residents. Therefore, the Privileges and Immunities Clause cuts both ways on the question of the balance of power. It allows the states to determine and uphold their own laws autonomously. But it also emphasizes that the national citizenship is more important than state citizenship. The evolving concept of federalism. The nature of federalism has changed as the size and functions of the national and state governments have evolved. In the first century of our nation's history, the national government played a relatively limited role, and the boundaries between the levels of government were distinct. As the national government took on more power in the 20th century, intergovernmental relations became more cooperative and the boundaries less distinct. Even within the more cooperative framework, federalism remains a source of conflict within our political system, both because the levels of government share lawmaking authority and because they may disagree over the details of government policy. The early years. As the United States gained its footing, clashes between the advocates of state-centered and nation-centered federalism evolved into partisan struggle. The Federalists, the party of George Washington, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton, controlled the new government for its first 12 years and favored strong national power. One of their strongest allies was Chief Justice John Marshall, who wrote several landmark Supreme Court decisions that enhanced the power of the national government. The Federalist opponents, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, favored state power, or as it came to be known, dual federalism. Dual federalism, as we will discuss, was the guiding principle of Marshall's successor as Chief Justice Roger Taney. Table 3.1 highlights several important decisions resolved during Marshall's and Taney's tenures on the court, establishing a national supremacy. The first confrontation came when the Federalists established a national bank in 1791, followed by a second national bank in 1816. At that time, the state of Maryland, which was controlled by Democratic Republicans, tried to tax the National Bank's Baltimore branch out of existence. However, the bank refused to pay the tax, creating a conflict that sent the case to the Supreme Court. In the landmark decision, McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, Marshall's court held that even though the word bank does not appear in the Constitution, Congress's power to create one is implied through its relevant enumerated powers, such as the power to coin money, levy taxes, and borrow money. The court also ruled that Maryland did not have the right to tax the bank because of the Constitution's National Supremacy Clause. A few years later, Marshall's Court held in Gibson versus Ogden, 1824, that Congress has broad power to regulate interstate commerce. The ruling struck down a New York law that had granted a monopoly to a private company that was operating steamboats on the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. By granting this monopoly, New York was interfering with the interstate commerce, a power reserved to Congress by the Constitution. Even in the modern era, this ruling underlies many of the federal government's regulations on businesses, which are based on the expectation that virtually any commercial activity will involve buying and selling across state lines. The emergence of state rights and dual federalism. Under Marshall's successor, Chief Justice Roger Taney, court decisions involving federalism shifted to reflect a new concept, dual federalism. According to the system of dual federalism, the national and state governments are considered distinct, with little overlap in their activities or the services they provide. In this view, the national government's activities are confined to powers strictly enumerated in the Constitution. Dual federalism was expressed most consequently in the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision of 1857. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived for many years with his owner in the free state of Illinois and the free Wisconsin Territory, but was living in Missouri, a slave state. When his master died, Scott petitioned for his freedom under the Missouri Compromise, which made slavery illegal in any free state. The court did not grant Scott his freedom. Its majority decision held that enslaved people were not citizens, but private property. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise's ban on slavery in certain territories violated the Fifth Amendment because it deprived citizens, owners of enslaved people, of their property without due process of law. Put in another way, the Dred Scott decision said that the state law, not federal, determined the legal status of enslaved people, contrasting Marshall's decision in favor of national power with Taney's decisions in favor of state power, highlights the policy consequences of judicial decisions. The Taney Court's decision that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional is consistent with dual federalism interpretation of the Constitution, but it also sustained the legality of slavery in southern states and halted attempts by representatives from the North to limit the spread of slavery into western territories. There is little doubt that Taney favored his outcome on policy grounds. In this sense, debates about dual federalism during this time were really about the legality of slavery, its expansion into new states, and the rights of formerly enslaved people in free states. Arguments about the dual federalism are sometimes framed using concept of states' rights. The idea that states retain some powers under the Constitution, specifically those reserved by the 10th Amendment, can ignore federal policies that encroach on these powers. The key question is, where does federal authority end and state authority begin? As this chapter demonstrates, the lines are not always easy to define and are still being debated today. Some people argue that Southern states fought the Civil War to preserve the concept of states' rights, but this argument tells only a fraction of the whole story. Southern secessioners secessionists, were not interested in states' rights per se. What they wanted was to continue slavery without federal intervention. States' rights was a convenient rationale for the pro-slavery position. After the Civil War, Constitution amendments banned slavery. The 13th Amendment prohibited states from denying citizens due process or the equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment and gave newly freed men the right to vote. The 15th Amendment. Congress also passed the 1875 Civil Rights Act, although it was later overturned by the Supreme Court. The 14th Amendment was the most important in terms of federalism because it was the constitutional basis for many of the civil rights laws passed by the federal government during Reconstruction. The Civil War fundamentally changed the way Americans thought about the relationship between the national government and the states. Before the war, people said, "The United States are," but after the war, they said, "The United States is." The Supreme Court and limited national government. The assertion of power by Congress during Reconstruction was short-lived, as Supreme Court soon stepped in again to limit the power of national government. In 1873, the court reinforced the notion of dual federalism, ruling that the 14th Amendment did not change the balance of power between the national and state governments. Specifically, the court ruled that the 14th Amendment, right to due process and equal treatment under the law, applied to individuals' rights only as citizens of the United States, not to their state citizenship. By extension, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the other liberties protected in the Bill of Rights applied only to laws passed by Congress, not to state laws. Here again, these decisions can be read as an articulation of theoretical interpretation of the Constitution, but they are also part of a broader, more concrete debate over how much the government should regulate interactions between individuals and corporations. In 1883, the court overturned the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which had guaranteed equal treatment in public accommodations. The court argued that the 14th Amendment did not give Congress the power to regulate private conduct, such as whether a white restaurant owner had to serve a black customer. It affected only the conduct of state governments, not individuals in these states. This narrow view of the 14th Amendment left the national government powerless to prevent southern states from implementing state and local laws that led to complete segregation of blacks and whites in the South, called the Jim Crow laws, and the denial of many basic rights to blacks after Northern troops left the South at the end of Reconstruction. The Supreme Court also limited the reach of the national government by curtailing Congress's authority to regulate the economy through its Commerce Clause powers. In several cases in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Supreme Court endorsed a view of laissez-faire, French for leave alone. Capitalism aimed at protecting businesses from regulation by the national government. To this end, the court defined clear boundaries between interstate and intrastate commerce, ruling that Congress could not regulate any economic activity that occurred within a state, intrastate. On similar grounds, the court also struck down attempts by Congress to regulate child labor. Cooperative Federalism. In the early years of the 20th century, and through the 1930s, a new era of American federalism emerged in which national government became more involved in activities that were formerly reserved for the states, such as transportation, civil rights, social welfare, and management labor relations. Starting in 1937 with the landmark ruling National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation, the Supreme Court gave Congress far more latitude to shape economical and social policy for the nation. Shifting national relations. The type of federalism that emerged in this era is called Cooperative Federalism or marble cake federalism, as opposed to the layer cake model of dual federalism. As the image of a marble cake suggests, the boundaries of state and national responsibilities are not as well defined under cooperative federalism as under dual federalism. With the increasing industrialization and urbanization of the late 1930s and 1940s, along with the Great Depression, more complex problems arose that could not be solved at one level of government. Cooperative federalism adopted a more practical focus on intergovernmental relations and the efficient delivery of services. State and local governments maintained some influence as the implementers of national programs, but the national government played an enhanced role as the initiator, director, and funder of key policies. Cooperative federalism accurately describes as this important shift in national-state relations in the first half of the 20th century, but it only partially captures the complexity of modern federalism. The marble cake metaphor falls short in one important way. The lines of authority and patterns of cooperation are not as messy as implied by the swirly flow of chocolate through white cake. Instead, the 1960s metaphor of picket fence federalism is a better description of cooperative federalism in action, as the how it works. Versions of federalism graphic shows each picket of the fence represents a different policy area, and the horizontal boards that hold the pickets together represent the different levels of government. This is much more orderly image than the marble cake, and it has important implications about how policy is made across levels of government. The most important point to be drawn from this analogy is that activity in the cooperative federal system occurs within pickets of the fence, that is, within policy areas. Policymakers within a given policy area will have more in common with others in that area, even if they are at different levels of government, than they do with the people who work in different areas, even if they are at the same level of government. For example, someone working in a state's Department of Natural Resources will have more contact with people working in local park programs and the National Department of the Interior than with the people who also work at the state level, but who focus on, say, law enforcement. Overall, this version of federalism provides good opportunities for coordination and the sharing of expertise within policy areas. This is the end of Chapter 3, Part 1.